The majority of the world's population, right now as we speak, is actively worshiping Yahweh. And I just don't understand how something so psychopathic and egomaniacal could be ordained as, quote, divinity. I mean, we're talking of a so-called God that refers to itself as a jealous God, a wrathful God. Yet, that's two of the seven deadlies that he says you can't do. But he takes that on as a label to describe himself. So we have a level of hypocrisy. He demands animal sacrifice, the sacrifice of the firstborn, sacrifice via genital mutilation by way of circumcision. We have genocide, the subjugation of women, and just the list goes on and on and on of all of these deplorable and reprehensible qualities. I mean, I find it to be so contemptible that every time I attempt to understand what divinity means to the majority of the world's population, I just find myself nauseated and angered. And I have a difficult time even confronting the words on the fucking page of the Holy Scriptures. Because the whole time, I mean, to say cringeworthy as a figure of speech isn't enough. Like, I quite literally cringe and facepalm. I like, it's so difficult that I honestly can't even confront it. Then again, it's quite intriguing as well. I need to attack it in small increments of time because I can only tolerate so much. But I force myself to read that fucking thing, lately, at least 30 minutes a day. Usually with my cup of coffee first thing in the morning. And I cannot believe what I am reading. And then I did the same thing to the Quran. The Quran's even fucking worse. And then I read the Old Testament, and that's probably the worst of all. I thought, how could it be worse than the God of the Bible? But then I read the God of the Old Testament, like, holy shit, just when you think it couldn't get any worse. But the point is, I've looked for divinity for a long time. I have, as strange as it might sound, a hunger for a religious experience that is divine enough to be worthy of my time. If there was something that I recognized as higher than myself, I would at the very least respect it. I can't see myself worshiping anything, no matter how benevolent it might be. But I could see myself finding something worthy to respect and to look up upon as a role model for me to emulate, etc. But I just don't see it. And I've looked. I've become convinced that there's just no divinity here. And it's unfortunate because I want to find divinity. I want to experience it. But it's just not there. You're not going to find it in the church. And even when you read the religions that are less terrible, like the Dharmic religions in particular, Hinduism and Buddhism, I find that there's a lot more truth there, but still, I haven't found anything that's truly divine. I just don't think there is any divinity here. If I had to describe divinity, it would actually be the meditative state. Because in the meditative state, if the Gnostic theory is true, that matter is evil, and therefore sensory integration towards this world at large is something that is ultimately a metaphysical sickness onto the spirit of man, then by me in dark, barricaded isolation with my eyes closed in a meditative state to the point where thoughts cease and my body becomes numb. When I go into that state of sublime nothingness, I feel as though I am occupying the Pleroma, which is a Gnostic word that means fullness. I do feel that I experience a sort of divinity, but this divinity is not found in this world. It's actually me having a semi out of body experience where I enter into Tiamat, which is the Mesopotamian god that represents the primordial waters of pre-existence. And this is ultimately where I think Brahma as well came from. It's this abysmal void. And when I say abysmal, I don't mean bad. I mean abysmal like an abyss. It's a void. It's a no thing or a nothingness. But that very nothingness is the fullness of the Pleroma, where they say that the spirit of man longs to return. And I actually find that you don't have to have bodily death to enter this place. In fact, even if you don't meditate, you enter this place while you're sleeping at night and as you're falling asleep as well. That's why it feels so good when you're falling asleep. That's why when you open your eyes and you just want to sleep as long as you possibly can, even though you've got your 8 hours, because it just feels so goddamn good. That state of nothingness where you leave your ego, you leave your body, you leave the world of matter, you're going into the void of the deepest depths of your psyche and even beyond. So I would say that that is divine. But the thing is, other than that, I don't see any divinity here in this realm. I can't, and I've tried. Believe you me, I have read the scriptures. I have read the philosophical works. And I find knowledge, sure. But the knowledge is really just a self-defense mechanism as to how to recognize this terrible place for the terrible place that it is and to avoid the evils that await. That's basically all knowledge is. It's a it's a defense mechanism, okay? So I wouldn't necessarily say that knowledge is divine per se. Knowledge just gives you the truth that's based in the negation of all things. Truth is negation. It's basically saying, I call bullshit. Your dipole of false dichotomy, where you have one truth that's apparently the opposite of another truth. You ever notice that everything in this world that is a lie masquerades as a truth? You know, as far as I'm concerned, it's all just linguistics. They're just concepts that belong to a certain wordage that either corresponds to some filthy material object or, even worse, it corresponds to an intangible abstraction that means absolutely nothing. And the only knowledge that I find that is worthy of the name is that which is based in negation, that recognizes that all so-called truths of this world is just a lie. And once you realize that everything is a lie, that's when you have the truth. Truth doesn't necessarily tell you something that is profound or extraordinary. Truth just merely tells you what is not. Basically, truth says that in which they say it is, guess what? It is not. That truth over there, that truth over there, that truth over there, they're all lies. All so-called truths are just lies. And then, what are you left with? You're left with an agitated mind that is bombarded with falsehood at all times. And then, what do you do to overcome that? Well, you get right with the real divinity, which is the sublime nothingness. And you go into that state of dark sensory deprivation until you get into that meditative state. And then, once you've entered the Pleroma, or that fullness, which is where spirit longs to reside, full time, where there's no body, it's just the Pleroma, there's the divinity right there. But when I say there is no divinity to be found here on earth, I mean it. But this divinity that I speak of, it's an out-of-body experience. There is a divine emotionality, but there is no language or sensory perception at all. And sometimes you are able to be in a Zen meditative state where you're actually able to take the Pleroma with you, completely embodied, as you're conducting your daily affairs. I wish I can be in that state all the time. But most of the time my mind just goes a million miles an hour when I'm confronted with all of these truths that I know are just fucking lies. That's all the wise man does. He just counts the lies and recognizes them as lies, and he says, there's your truth. There's no divinity here. Divinity is only found, as far as I'm concerned, in the Pleroma. The Pleroma is the divine. And that's it. But when it comes to what man wants to ascribe as divine, well, words like love, truth, freedom, beauty, and morality come to mind. But again, everything's inverted. What people call morality is actually immorality. What people call freedom is actually slavery. What people call truth is falsehood. What people call beauty is ugly, etc., etc., etc. To me, the true freedom is the Pleroma. The real truth is the Pleroma. That's the beauty. That's the profundity. Strangely enough, as I talk about it, I start to feel kind of emotional. Not to the point where I would feel like crying, but I do get overwhelmed just by talking about it. But the interesting thing is, because it's entirely non-perceptual, entirely non-linguistic, yet I say that this nothingness is the ultimate freedom. This nothingness is the closest thing to a religious experience that there can be. But the thing about Earth realm beings is that when they talk about their truths that are really falsehood, it's all just linguistics, isn't it? It's just words, 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 words. And people's idea of freedom is really the freedom of movement, the freedom to do whatever the fuck you want. But when it comes to the triad of be, do, and have, I find that the real profundity when it comes to all of those higher aspirations that we might call the magnum opus, the zenith, the apotheosis, the apex, right? It's not found in doingness. It's not found in havingness. It's found in beingness alone, but not beingness as in identifications, where I say, I want to be a rock star. I want to be a womanizer. I want to be a guru. No, not those beingness or those states of being. Those are just identifications that belong to this realm. When I say beingness, I'm talking about the Pleroma. I'm talking about the divine nothingness. Where consciousness exists alone as consciousness. This realm is entirely black, without sensory integration, without language, without concepts. That's what I mean by true beingness. People get the word being completely ass backwards, because when they say to be, they mean to be something. I want to be a doctor. I want to be a good father. I want to be. But their idea of beingness is very extroverted. It's not the way I'm using beingness. Beingness is the fullness of the Pleroma. And once you arrive there, you never want to leave. And unfortunately, it's temporary, because you end up coming back into the density of your body. Back to the do, so you can have. And when it comes to be, as far as that's concerned, it's, well, I'm going to be my profession. I'm going to be this and I'm going to be that and all that extroverted fucking nonsense. That's not the way I mean to say these things. Love, truth, freedom, beauty, and morality, or divinity for that matter, is not found here. All of those things are only found in the Pleroma. And that is my idea of divinity. That is my idea of base reality, believe it or not. See, people have, excuse me one moment. People have this idea that base reality is a location. They like to project an anthropomorphization of their self as they know it to be here, and this world as they know it to be here, and they like to say, well, this is just a bad copy of the real world. We need to go back to base reality, as if it's something over the hills and far away, some kind of never-ever land. But let me tell you something. That's not base reality. Base reality is the Pleroma. And that is the very essence that makes you the spiritual being that you are. That is the static. That is the inertia. And that fullness makes us juxtaposed to an NPC who can't even comprehend such a thing as the Pleroma, because they are what I call the unincarnated. They're unincarnated, I believe, because they're essentially a body entity that belongs to a generalized abstraction. It belongs to a universal essence, where its impetus, which is the force in which its body moves, belongs to the will of the species. So when I say the unincarnated, there is no individualistic principle of spiritual incarnation within them. They are a brain body with no spirit. That's really what I think. That's why their ideas of divinity are all fucked up. You know? Divinity to them is the utterance of a fucking word. They say, heaven, God, my country. It always corresponds because they're cardinal minded. Because they're so cardinal minded, all of those principles of profundity in the most inverted sense on their account is always towards materiality, linguistics, and intangible concepts that don't correspond to any fucking thing but their own imagination. They're completely, well, to say that they are the dead is superfluous, because they were never really alive to begin with. And because they were never really alive to begin with, they're not only just dead, for all intents and purposes, because there's no spiritual incarnation, and they are codependent upon the existence of the Matrix to live, and that's why they fight and serve to protect it. They might as well be non-existent, because if you were to press the big red button, and all materiality and all fleshly matter would dissolve into nothing, you would be left with nothing more than the incarnation of the spirit of man, and you would go right back to the Pleroma, where you belong. But the good news is, you've never really left the Pleroma. A good analogy would be visiting a loved one at a prison, and you can only communicate to your loved one through the bulletproof glass, and you can only talk to them through the prison phone, through the wall. Now, your loved one is still there. You can put your hand over the glass onto their hand. You can kiss them through the glass. You can hear their muffled voice through the phone. They're still there, but there's a heartbreaking separation between you. That's what it's like trying to be one with the Pleroma when you're in a body, in the wakeful state. But the glass shatters once you enter into that meditative state of the sublime nothingness. And once you're in that state of non-linguistics, non-conceptuality, non-physicality, just that beautiful blackness that is the true freedom, that is truth itself, etc., you're able to become one with it and realize that you were never separate from it. You were always the Pleroma. And the reason why you suffer so much is because you're trying to find something divine here, when only the Pleroma is divine, and you are already the Pleroma. But when you look outward, there's no divinity to be found. There's no truth to be found, freedom, etc. And that's why it's so frustrating for spiritual beings to be in a place like this. Because I believe the Gnostics were right when they said that this is a bad copy of the real world, created by some sort of an evil demiurgic force. And, the body is the prison for the soul, and all these sorts of things. But what they get wrong, a lot of Gnostics, is they talk about the Pleroma as if it's something unreachable and unknowable. A lot of people don't realize that they are that very fullness. They are that very Pleroma. Always. They are always that base reality. So, when I exit this plane of existence, I'm not going to go to the light. That void that the religions tell you to avoid, I'm going to look down into that downward darkness, and I'm going to go straight into that abyss, straight into those primordial waters. Because that is the true divinity to which I long to return. And mark my words, we will return to the source of who we are. We will. But as long as this matrix continues to endure, and as long as our attachments to return to samsara continue to occur, let me tell you something. This is definitely my last incarnation. I don't believe the state of moksha, or the liberation from the reincarnation soul trap, is a state of being that has to be earned. I feel like people like us who are already at this level, that are in that state of non-duality, because of what non-duality means to me is just recognizing that everything is based in false dichotomy and it's all just bullshit. So when you're in non-duality, you just recognize everything as falsehood, and you've escaped it. And then once you've done that, you have reached the state of moksha. The only thing that we are to do, as far as I'm concerned, now that we're alive, still here, is to be as detached as possible, and to not get emotionally invested or ideologically invested in any fucking thing. The true virtues for a Gnostic, as far as I'm concerned, is indifference, non-action, and isolation in so much as possible. And just really embrace indifference as your sort of happiness. Any closing statements I would like to make? I fucking hate this realm. I hate this realm with every fiber of my being. I find the gods that people worship repugnant. I find the world leaders to be repugnant. I find the masses to be a bunch of brainwashed, filthy slaves that are operating at a level of subhumanity. I find nature to be nothing but a feeding frenzy of carnivorous disembowelment. Everything. I want you to really let this comprehend that we live in a world where everything feasts upon the flesh of something that is weaker than it. Next time somebody tells you to enjoy nature, say, I tried that shit once. I went outside with bare feet and my shirt off, and before you knew it, there were ants biting my feet, There were mosquitoes sucking my blood. And as I wandered into the wilderness, there were spider webs and a bunch of venomous fucking bugs and snakes. And I was hungry, but there was no water, and there was trees all around me, but none of them bared any fruit. Ugh, what an abomination. The reason why people find divinity here is because they don't know any better. They don't have a frame of reference for anything but this place. But we have an unconscious remembrance of something far greater, which is the Pleroma that we have been divorced from for probably hundreds, if not thousands of years. But yet, the Pleroma is still within us. We are that very Pleroma, like I said. However, the unincarnated, the Earth Realm beings, the NPCs, rather, they love this realm so much because it's all they've ever known. And they worship it because it's the very abomination that gives them their artificial existence as it is. So that's why they worship it. If you would like to add me on Facebook, send me a personal message, you could do so at Fish Corbett. That is Fishcorbett. Thank you.